Tonight, we're diving into the life and legacy of the legendary physicist Albert Einstein. Einstein was a brilliant, curious, and revolutionary thinker who reshaped our understanding of the universe, challenged the boundaries of science, and left a legacy that continues to inspire minds around the world today. So, before you settle in and get cozy, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments where and when you're watching from. Now, let's get into this fascinating story of genius, perseverance, and discovery. We hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the small German city of Ulm, nestled on the banks of the Danube River, a baby was born on March 14, 1879. His name was Albert Einstein. Few would have guessed that this quiet, observant child, slow to speak and oddly detached from the world around him, would one day become one of the most revolutionary minds in human history. Albert's early years were not marked by genius. In fact, some in his family worried about him. He didn't talk until the age of 3, and even then, he would repeat his sentences under his breath, as if trying to make sense of his own thoughts. His parents, Hermann and Pauline Einstein, were supportive but puzzled. Hermann was a modest businessman who ran an electrical company, and Pauline, a cultured woman, had a deep love for music. It was she who introduced Albert to the violin, a connection that would bring him peace throughout his life. When Albert was still a toddler, the family moved to Munich. There, his father and uncle started an electrical engineering company, bringing electricity to cities and towns in southern Germany. The household was filled with scientific curiosity and discussion. Though money was often tight, the home was rich with books and ideas. Albert was not a star student. In fact, his teachers considered him lazy and rebellious. He didn't enjoy the strict discipline of German schools, where rote memorization and obedience were valued above creativity. But outside the classroom, he was endlessly curious. One of the turning points in his childhood came when he was given a simple compass. He was just 5 years old. As he watched the needle mysteriously point north, no matter how he turned it, something stirred in him, a desire to understand the invisible forces that govern the world. By the time he was a teenager, Albert had developed a deep interest in mathematics and physics. He taught himself calculus before most kids had mastered long division. He read books on science with the intensity of a young man searching for truth. But his schooling remained rocky. Teachers often misunderstood him. One even told him he would never amount to anything. At 16, Albert dropped out of high school. His parents had moved to Italy after their business failed, leaving Albert behind in Munich. Eventually, he rejoined them, and together they planned his next step, to apply to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich. Though he failed the entrance exam the first time, struggling with non-scientific subjects like languages and history, he passed the second time after a year of preparation. In Zurich, Einstein found a place where his ideas could breathe. He was still far from famous. He was still just a student, often distracted, often clashing with professors. But he was on a path. The quiet boy from Ulm was beginning to awaken. Albert Einstein arrived in Zurich in 1896, ready to begin his studies at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, one of the most respected technical schools in Europe. He was just 17, a bit disheveled, with intense eyes and a mind already overflowing with ideas. Though he had passed the entrance exam on his second try, he didn't exactly fit the mold of a traditional student. Einstein's time at the Polytechnic was a mix of inspiration and frustration. He loved physics and mathematics but had little patience for subjects he found uninteresting or professors who taught by rigid rules. His favorite professor, Hermann Minkowski, once described him as a lazy dog, but even that same professor would later be inspired by Einstein's ideas. Albert often skipped classes and instead studied independently, diving deep into the writings of Newton, Maxwell, and most importantly, Ernst Mach. These thinkers stirred his imagination and shaped his emerging view of the universe. While many of his classmates focused on passing exams, Einstein chased something else entirely: truth. He wanted to understand the laws of nature, not just memorize formulas. He discussed ideas with friends, questioned assumptions, and filled notebooks with thoughts that didn't yet have names. He also met a fellow student who would become a significant part of his life, Mileva Maric. She was one of the few women studying science at the time. Their friendship deepened into romance, though their relationship would face many challenges in the years to come. In 1900, Einstein graduated, but not with flying colors. His rebellious attitude had left him with few allies among the faculty. When it came time to find a job, his professors refused to recommend him. For months, he was unemployed, living in poverty, sending desperate letters in search of work. He even considered becoming a teacher or technician, just to pay the bills. Eventually, with the help of a friend's father, he landed a job at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern in 1902. The position wasn't glamorous. He reviewed technical inventions and applications all day, but it provided a steady income and, more importantly, time to think. Einstein would later say that the job's repetitive nature allowed his mind to wander, to imagine, to create. In that quiet office, between the stacks of patent files and routine paperwork, Albert began to sketch out the theories that would change the world. He scribbled equations on scraps of paper. He wrestled with questions about light, motion, and time. No university. No lab. Just a desk, a pen, and a relentless curiosity. He and Mileva married in 1903. A year later, their first son, Hans Albert, was born. Life was still difficult. They lived simply, scraping by, but Einstein never stopped thinking. He was not yet a name known around the world. He was a clerk in an office. But deep inside, he was preparing for a revolution in physics that no one saw coming. By 1905, Albert Einstein was 26 years old, living in Bern with his wife, Mileva, and working full-time at the Swiss Patent Office. To the outside world, he was just a modest civil servant, reading over inventions and stamping approvals. But behind closed doors, a storm of ideas was forming, ideas that would soon change the foundation of physics. That year would come to be known as Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year. In the span of just 12 months, Einstein published 4 groundbreaking papers in the Annalen der Physik, one of the leading physics journals of the time. Each one addressed a different mystery, and together they would shake the scientific world. The first paper explained the photoelectric effect, a phenomenon where light striking certain metals caused them to emit electrons. Scientists had observed it, but couldn't fully explain it. Einstein proposed that light wasn't just a wave, it could also behave like a particle, a photon. This idea would later form the basis of quantum theory, and it would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. The second paper explored the existence of atoms, which was still a debated topic at the time. Einstein used mathematical analysis to describe Brownian motion, the random movement of particles suspended in a fluid. His explanation provided strong evidence that atoms and molecules were real, not just theoretical concepts. This paper helped convince skeptics that the atomic theory of matter was valid. The third paper introduced the special theory of relativity. It challenged 2 basic assumptions held by physicists: that time and space were fixed, and that motion followed absolute rules. Einstein argued that the laws of physics are the same for all observers, no matter how fast they're moving, and that the speed of light is constant, no matter the observer's motion. From this came a stunning conclusion: time and space are not absolute. They bend and stretch depending on the speed at which you travel. Finally, the fourth paper, the shortest of them all, introduced an equation that would become one of the most famous in history: E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. In other words, mass and energy are interchangeable. A small amount of mass contains an enormous amount of energy. This idea would not only change physics, it would eventually play a role in the development of nuclear energy and atomic weapons. Einstein had written all of these papers while holding down a day job, with no access to a laboratory or research grants. He was a true outsider in the world of academic science, yet his ideas reached into its very heart. In 1905, the world didn't yet realize what had happened. But the ripples had begun. Letters and questions started arriving. Some scientists were intrigued. Others were skeptical. Many were baffled. But one thing was becoming clear. Albert Einstein was no ordinary patent clerk. He was a visionary. After the astonishing achievements of 1905, Albert Einstein was no longer just a clerk at the Swiss Patent Office. He was quickly becoming a name to watch in the world of theoretical physics. Yet recognition did not come overnight. At first, many in the scientific community viewed his work with skepticism. Some were confused by his radical ideas, while others simply didn't believe that someone working outside the university system could produce such groundbreaking theories. But slowly, the tide began to shift. Physicists across Europe started to take notice, especially those grappling with the same problems Einstein had so elegantly addressed. His explanation of the photoelectric effect caught the attention of Max Planck, the founder of quantum theory and a respected figure in German science. Planck wrote to Einstein, praising his insights and inviting him into the broader academic conversation. It was the beginning of Einstein's entry into the scientific elite. In 1908, Einstein was finally offered his first academic position, Privatdozent at the University of Bern. It was unpaid, and he still worked full-time at the patent office. But now, he was teaching students, lecturing, and beginning to shape the minds of the next generation. By 1909, the recognition grew stronger. He left the patent office behind and accepted a full professorship at the University of Zurich. Einstein's life began to change rapidly. More offers followed. In 1911, he moved to the German-speaking University of Prague, becoming a full professor and Austrian citizen. Then, in 1912, he returned to Zurich to teach at his alma mater, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, where his influence continued to grow. During this time, Einstein remained deeply focused on one goal: building a new understanding of gravity. Special relativity had explained how time and space worked for objects moving at constant speeds. But it didn't account for acceleration or gravity, the great force that governs stars, planets, and galaxies. Einstein believed that gravity wasn't a force pulling objects together, as Isaac Newton had described. Instead, he imagined something far more elegant, that mass bends space and time itself. Objects don't move because they're being pulled, they move along the curves created by this bending. It was a bold vision, and it would take him years to develop the mathematics to support it. Meanwhile, his personal life was growing more complicated. His marriage to Mileva Marek had begun to unravel. Their relationship, once built on shared curiosity and intellectual partnership, was now strained by distance, arguments, and growing emotional gaps. They eventually separated, and in 1919, after years of tension, the marriage ended in divorce. But even in the midst of personal turmoil, Einstein pressed forward. His mind was still reaching into the heart of the cosmos, looking for the hidden structure beneath everything. And soon, he would find it. The theory that would define his legacy was coming into focus. By 1912, Albert Einstein was consumed by a singular obsession: to expand his special theory of relativity into something larger, something that included gravity and acceleration. He wanted to understand how the universe truly worked on a grand scale. But what he envisioned required complex mathematics beyond anything he had used before. So he turned to an old friend from his student days, Marcel Grossman, a brilliant mathematician. Together, they explored the language of differential geometry and tensor calculus, tools Einstein would need to describe how mass could bend space and time. The work was slow and grueling. He often doubted himself, scrapped entire drafts, and circled back again. At times, the math seemed to resist him. But he pressed on, convinced he was on the right path. Years passed. Einstein took a position in Berlin in 1914, joining the prestigious Prussian Academy of Sciences. It was a high honor, allowing him to focus purely on research. But the world around him was growing darker. War had broken out across Europe. World War I raged, consuming countries, cities, and lives. Einstein was a pacifist. He detested violence and nationalism. While many of his colleagues supported the war, he remained outspoken in his opposition, isolating himself further in the scientific community. His family life, too, was troubled. His marriage with Mileva had ended, and he rarely saw their sons. He had begun a relationship with his cousin Elsa, who would eventually become his second wife. Amid the personal and political chaos, Einstein worked relentlessly. And finally, in November 1915, after nearly a decade of effort, he completed his masterpiece, the general theory of relativity. The theory proposed something revolutionary. Gravity is not a force between masses, but a warping of space-time caused by mass and energy. Massive objects like stars and planets bend the fabric of space and time, and other objects follow the curves of that bending. What we feel as gravity is actually the result of motion along these curved paths. It was a breathtaking leap in understanding. But Einstein knew he needed proof. A theory was only as good as its predictions. And general relativity made a bold one. It predicted that light would bend around massive objects, like the sun, due to the warping of space-time. If true, it could be observed during a total solar eclipse, when the sun's light was blocked, and starlight passing near it could be measured for deflection. Einstein waited, hopeful, but the war delayed everything. Then, in 1919, during a total eclipse visible from the southern hemisphere, a British expedition led by astronomer Arthur Eddington observed exactly what Einstein had predicted. Starlight near the sun appeared shifted, bent by gravity. The news spread like wildfire. Einstein's theory had been proven. Overnight, he became a global sensation. Headlines around the world declared him a genius. He was no longer just a physicist. He was a symbol of human brilliance. But fame, as Einstein would learn, brought both opportunity and burden. The year 1919 changed everything. After the eclipse confirmed his general theory of relativity, Albert Einstein's name leapt from obscure academic journals to front pages around the globe. Newspapers hailed him as a modern-day Galileo. He became an overnight celebrity, not just in the scientific community, but in popular culture. For the first time, a physicist was a household name. Einstein was amused, even bewildered by the attention. He hadn't changed, but the world suddenly saw him through a new lens. Wherever he went, crowds gathered. Reporters followed him. Universities offered him positions. Awards poured in. His image, wild hair, thoughtful eyes, and worn clothes, became iconic. But Einstein didn't chase fame. If anything, he found it distracting. He continued working, driven by curiosity, not applause. He gave lectures around the world, traveling to England, the United States, France, and Japan. In 1921, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics, not for relativity, but for his 1905 paper on the photoelectric effect, which had laid the foundation for quantum theory. Still, he remained deeply focused on understanding the universe. He turned his attention to unifying the forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, and eventually quantum mechanics. But the more he tried to reconcile these theories, the more physics seemed to evolve in unpredictable ways. Quantum mechanics was exploding in the 1920s. A new generation of physicists, like Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Erwin Schrödinger, were revealing the strange, probabilistic nature of the atomic world. They argued that at the smallest scales, particles didn't behave with certainty, but with probability. Events could happen randomly, without cause. Einstein couldn't accept it. "God does not play dice with the universe," he famously said. To him, nature had to be governed by precise laws. The randomness of quantum mechanics went against everything he believed about a rational, ordered cosmos. This led to a long and respectful debate with Niels Bohr, one of the founding fathers of quantum theory. Their discussions became legendary. Einstein would devise thought experiments to challenge the uncertainty principle, and Bohr would counter them, showing that the quantum world really did defy classical logic. Einstein wasn't stubborn for the sake of ego. He simply believed there was a deeper level of reality that hadn't yet been uncovered. He wasn't opposed to quantum mechanics. He just thought it was incomplete. Outside of science, Einstein was also becoming a voice of reason and humanity. He spoke out against nationalism, militarism, and injustice. A Jewish man in increasingly unstable post-war Germany, he warned of the dangers rising in Europe. He advocated for civil rights, education, and peace. He believed science had a responsibility beyond discovery. It had to serve humanity. But storms were gathering once again. As the 1930s approached, Germany was changing. The economy was in ruin. Political extremism was spreading. And Einstein, both a Jew and a symbol of internationalism, found himself in the crosshairs. The world that once celebrated him was about to turn dangerous. After World War II, Albert Einstein emerged not only as the most famous scientist in the world, but also as one of its most thoughtful moral voices. He was now in his late 60s, settled into a quiet life in Princeton, New Jersey. His white hair had become iconic, his name synonymous with genius. But Einstein was no longer focused solely on physics. He was consumed by something larger, the survival of humanity. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shaken him deeply. Though he hadn't worked directly on the Manhattan Project, his scientific legacy had played a role. The equation he had published decades earlier, E equals mc superscript 2, was the scientific cornerstone of nuclear energy. And now, it had helped unleash a force of unimaginable destruction. Einstein became a passionate advocate for nuclear disarmament. He warned that mankind had entered a new era, one where war could mean annihilation. He called for the creation of a world government, an international authority that could oversee nuclear weapons and prevent future conflict. Many saw the idea as idealistic. Some thought it naive. But Einstein believed the alternative was far worse. In 1946, he co-founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, which aimed to educate the public on the dangers of nuclear war. He gave speeches, wrote essays, and appeared in radio broadcasts. Wherever he spoke, his message was clear. The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, except our way of thinking. But his activism wasn't limited to science. Einstein became a strong supporter of civil rights in the United States. He was horrified by the racial segregation and discrimination he saw, especially in the American South. He publicly condemned racism as America's worst disease, and used his platform to speak on behalf of the oppressed. He was a friend of Paul Robeson, admired W.B. Du Bois, and even offered to testify on Du Bois' behalf when he was accused of being a communist. Einstein's outspokenness came at a cost. During the McCarthy era, when fear of communism gripped the U.S., Einstein was viewed with suspicion. His past affiliations with socialist and pacifist groups led to FBI surveillance. Some politicians and newspapers labeled him un-American, but he never backed down. He believed in freedom of thought, in open inquiry, and in moral responsibility. And he believed that science should serve humanity, not destroy it. Privately, he continued his search for a unified field theory, a set of equations that could bring together all the forces of nature. Gravity, electromagnetism, the quantum world. He hoped to find the common thread. He worked late into the night, scribbling on blackboards and jotting down equations. But the theory remained elusive. Physics had moved on, embracing quantum mechanics and new discoveries Einstein found troubling. Still, he pressed on, not for fame, not for recognition, but because he could not help it. For Einstein, understanding the universe was the most human of endeavors. And he never stopped trying. By the 1950s, Albert Einstein was more than a scientist. He was a global icon. People from all over the world wrote to him, students asking questions, scientists seeking advice, world leaders requesting support, and ordinary citizens looking for guidance in an increasingly uncertain world. Despite his fame, Einstein lived a quiet and humble life in Princeton, New Jersey. He declined most public appearances, preferring the calm of his study, the joy of sailing, and his beloved violin. He wore the same simple clothes each day, refusing socks altogether, and shunned material wealth. To him, happiness came from simplicity, thought, and purpose. Yet even in his later years, Einstein's mind remained active and restless. He continued to chase the unified field theory, determined to find a single framework that could connect the forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, and eventually quantum mechanics. But the physics world had moved on. Young scientists were focused on quantum electrodynamics and particle physics, embracing the probabilistic nature of the universe that Einstein had never fully accepted. He worked mostly alone, often scribbling equations that only he could decipher, chasing a vision few others still believed in. Though his attempts at unification did not succeed, his commitment to the pursuit itself inspired generations of physicists. Einstein also became increasingly reflective in these final years. He wrote essays and letters filled with philosophical insight, on war, on peace, on religion, on human responsibility. He believed in a cosmic spirituality, not tied to dogma or religious institutions, but rooted in wonder. "I believe in Spinoza's God," he once said, "who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists." His views on politics remained firm. He continued to oppose war, to speak against nuclear weapons, and to advocate for a world united by reason and compassion. He called for cooperation, for education, and for the recognition that humanity's future depended on its ability to rise above tribalism and fear. In 1952, after the death of Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, Einstein was offered the presidency of Israel. It was a symbolic gesture, an honor offered not for political experience, but for his moral authority. He declined, saying he lacked the qualifications and temperament for such a role. But the offer itself was a testament to how deeply he was respected, not only as a scientist, but as a symbol of integrity and wisdom. On April 17, 1955, Albert Einstein experienced internal bleeding caused by a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. He was taken to Princeton Hospital. When offered surgery, he refused. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially," he said. "I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He passed away early the next morning, at the age of 76. His final words were spoken in German, but the nurse by his side did not speak the language. And so, the last thoughts of one of history's greatest minds were lost to time. Albert Einstein's body died on April 18, 1955, but his ideas, his image, and his legacy would never fade. The man who once worked quietly in a patent office had redefined our understanding of the universe. And long after his heart stopped beating, the world continued to feel the pulse of his genius. In the hours after his death, doctors performed an autopsy. In a controversial and unapproved move, the pathologists removed Einstein's brain, preserving it in the hope that future science might unlock the secrets of his intellect. The brain was sliced, studied, and even photographed, but no special structure or feature explained the brilliance that had lived within it. Because Einstein's genius, like the universe he studied, wasn't just in the matter. It was in the motion, the curiosity, the imagination. His scientific achievements had changed the world. His theory of relativity transformed our understanding of time, space, and gravity. His work on the photoelectric effect sparked the revolution of quantum mechanics. His equation, E equals mc squared, unlocked the secrets of energy hidden in every atom. But perhaps just as important was what Einstein stood for. He stood for the value of thinking freely, even when it meant standing alone. For asking questions that others were afraid to ask. For challenging authority, not out of rebellion, but out of a hunger for truth. He stood for peace, in a century torn apart by 2 world wars. He stood for justice, lending his voice to civil rights, to refugees, to the vulnerable and forgotten. And he stood for humility, despite having his name spoken alongside the greatest minds in human history. In the years that followed, his legacy grew. Schools were named after him. Statues were erected in his honor. His name became synonymous with brilliance. The photo of Einstein sticking out his tongue, taken on his 72nd birthday, became an icon of intellect wrapped in humor, seriousness balanced by playfulness. Einstein once said, "Try not to become a man of success, but rather a man of value." And in that, he succeeded beyond measure. His writings continued to inspire scientists, philosophers, and dreamers alike. Physicists still chased the theory he couldn't complete, a grand unified theory of everything. His work remains the foundation of modern physics, influencing everything from GPS technology to the study of black holes and the expansion of the cosmos. In 2016, over 60 years after his death, scientists finally observed gravitational waves, ripples in space-time predicted by Einstein 100 years earlier. The discovery confirmed what he had long believed, that the fabric of the universe is alive with movement, mystery, and beauty. Albert Einstein didn't just expand science. He expanded what it meant to be human. A rebel, a thinker, a dreamer, a man who saw beyond the visible, who followed questions into the stars, and who taught us that imagination, as he once said, is more important than knowledge, because knowledge is what is. Imagination is what could be.